Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, everyone, to this session this afternoon. We're going to be talking about the role of arts and culture in engaging citizens in climate emergencies. Thank you so much for joining us all on this sunny afternoon and taking the time to be with us. My name is Naomi and I work for Bristol Ideas. We're a platform for public debate and learning, bringing together arts and sciences to explore the key issues of our time. And I'm thrilled to be facilitating today's discussion. I'm really pleased to be joined by three dynamic and exciting speakers who are going to be sharing with us their insights and their lived experiences to spark a collective discussion. Each panellist will speak for 5 to 10 minutes in turn, after which we will come together for a group discussion, which includes you, our lovely audience. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see a Q&A tab. Please do add your questions in there throughout the session. We'd love to hear from you and we will answer as many of those we can in our limited time. If you'd like to say hello or post some links or share some content, please do that in the chat. And also do connect with the festival and everything that you're engaging with over the full festival, and particularly today at the conference with the hashtag Fest of Nature 21. Lovely. So first of all, we're going to come to Zoe Rasbash. Zoe has campaigned at the local, national and international level for just responses to the climate crisis. As environmental emergencies researcher at Watershed, she is co-developing a framework for climate action for the creative sector in the Southwest. Dedicated to a creative, just and sustainable future, she is a regular contributor to Shadow magazine and co-founder of Lilith Archive, focused on visual arts and the climate emergency. Previously, Zoe has worked on Amnesty International's climate strategy, led the UK youth delegation to COP 2024, sat as youth representative on the UN Task Force for Climate Displacement. Zoe, can I come to you first?
So much, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Matt, if you could get my PowerPoint up, that would be amazing. So hi, everyone. Yeah, that was a really nice introduction. My name is Zoe. As Naomi said, I'm a researcher at Watershed, the Cultural Cinema and Creative Technology Hub at the centre of Bristol, and I'm co-founder of Lilith Archive, which is a DIY digital archive platforming the brilliant diversity of women and non-binary filmmakers and moving image artists on nature. And my research at Watershed is focused on thinking about how the creative economy can best adapt to the climate crisis. So I'm really excited to be on this panel because I've been thinking a lot about the role of arts and culture in environmental emergencies as like a context and like a background for the work that I'm doing. Next slide, please, Matt. So I kind of wanted to highlight some other voices and thought leaders around the world who have some really great points on this topic to start. So last week, Mitzi Janelle Tan, an incredible youth activist from the Philippines, published this article in Teen Vogue, which was entitled, "The Mainstream Climate Change Movement Needs to Get More Creative." And in this article, she lays out some really amazing and salient points. So how the most affected by the climate and ecological crisis, so it's talking Indigenous people, small farmers, fisher folk, frontline activists from the global south, but also young people, poor people, non-English speaking people, are often left out of conversations which unfold amongst climate scientists and politicians who kind of use language and modes of communication in ways which are not always accessible nor kind of welcoming to the most affected. And there's this really great quote, which is in her article, which is, "Imagine if instead of PDFs and newspaper long reads, we shared the latest science through comic books, short stories, or virtual games. The vast majority of the world doesn't speak English as a first language, and most of what's written about the climate crisis right now," sorry, back one, Matt. Perfect. Most of what's written about the climate crisis right now is written in academic fancy English. Making climate activism accessible is about making sure that everyone can understand it, no matter their level of education or English proficiency. And I think that's a really salient point, which I'll circle back to. So when it comes to the climate and ecological crisis, it's so deeply, we so deeply associate it with like sacrifice and blame narratives, like you have to give up X in order to be, to help the planet. When actually we kind of need to be thinking, how can we build a society which is better for everyone, which is zero carbon, accessible, beautiful, we enjoy it. We kind of need to see it more as like a bountiful and urgent opportunity, which centers the voices of those most affected by climate change and also those marginalized by our current system. And so for this, Mitzi Janelle Tan lays out that we need to kind of democratize the conversation, which arts and culture can really help us do. more broadly, our current model of global economic organization doesn't work, right? We know this. We know it's the same systems that exploit our natural resources, pollute our planet, exploit people, equate a good quality of life with consuming more, rampant nature deprivation, epidemics of alienation, like a mental health crisis. It's all kind of linked. Next slide, please, Matt. But kind of as Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek say, it's easier to imagine an end of the world than it is an end to capitalism. But we kind of do need to start imagining and building something different. It's really urgent. And this is on a global scale, but also kind of on a local scale. So how is my area, my city, my street, my work, can we kind of start building joyful, accessible and useful kind of carbon neutral spaces, processes and infrastructure and a new way of life? What does that look like? And I think the art, culture and creative sectors can provide space for those who don't necessarily identify with the green agenda to kind of encounter these ideas and engage with them accessibly to find a common cause. And further, I think art and culture are an essential tool in helping us imagine something better. Building a just, sustainable society is what Alexis Fraz calls a truly creative challenge, in the sense that we're making something that we don't know what it is yet. And she's the director of Helicon Collaborative and is a real thought leader in this field. Next slide, please, Matt. And she talks about how we need a radical imagination beyond the boundaries of our current social reality. And this is because most of the principles of our current society are the root of the problem. She talks about how artists are specialists in imagination, rendering creative and broad ideas in tangible ways. And when working in collaboration more strategically towards a shared future with engineers, politicians, organizers, etc., across kind of all disciplines, it can really lead to impact and kind of making the collective imagination tangible. And also about how the creative process is about experimentation, finding new ways to do, understand, and be. And the creative process involves kind of active testing and iteration, and we kind of can experiment with our communities with creative-led practice now. So I'm kind of hope by sharing some of these thinkers and these people from across the world, that gives a little bit of context to how I'm thinking about this cross section. And as we kind of face this incredibly serious crisis, which I think we can all find a little bit difficult to comprehend at times, Watershed, where I'm working now, kind of recognize that it's not just about us as an organization changing, it's how can we enable the sector on more of a regional scale, about how the creative industries can adapt and kind of contribute to environmental action. And it's action that's got to be ambitious, it's got to be innovative, and it's got to be collective, and it's got to be outward facing. So my role is not just to think about how, one creative organization can change, but how we can transform as a sector and share practice and knowledge. And we want to kind of think beyond just climate and start bridging it with our inclusion work, so that we can pursue a pathway towards supporting climate justice rather than just simply reducing our environmental impact, have that kind of positive transformational mindset. Next slide, please, Matt. So my work is currently exploring these four questions. How are creative small, medium enterprises and micro companies and freelancers adapting already, and how might they? How do we support our cluster to make a real impact, bringing in small, medium enterprises who might not necessarily identify with the green agenda? How do we responses to the climate crisis intersect with our focus on inclusive innovation? And what's the role of the creative sector in a just transition? And this work's building towards producing a final framework for climate action, which considers the different levels of resources and capacities of different businesses and artists. And I'm currently working internally with Watershed Environment Group, with a group of people who are active on the environment, to kind of observe how larger creative organizations can create change and how we can share our findings, thinking about developing those practices which bridge inclusion in climate work, which help us make decisions which are environmentally friendly without reproducing exclusion. But also, how can we tackle the major blockages for everyone, which is resources and capacity, and use organizational practice to empower people across the organization to push for change. Next slide, please, Matt. But I'm also kind of investigating across the sector with a real focus on supporting creative freelancers, learning from flexible and adaptive business models, learning and mapping innovative and creative work of producers and artists doing really cool, innovative action, and mapping these practices to think about how we can collectivize this knowledge, which is quite dispersed across the field. And also kind of observing the impactful, exciting and transformational creative work going on, which leads to real change and kind of new forms of audience engagement. Basically, the question is, how can we harness the brilliance of the creative industries in the Southwest beyond just reducing our carbon, but in generating new ways to create positive and structural impact, kind of from small logistical changes to larger imaginative ones? What kind of sets us on the right path for change? That's it. Next slide, please, Matt. If you're a creative practitioner, I would love for you to get in touch. I'm always keen to hear people's thoughts, so you can reach me on my email here or my Twitter. Thanks for listening, everyone.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Zoe. There were so many things there which I know we're going to be circling back round on, especially seeing the nods of Charlotte and Toby in the background. So I can already tell there's a lot there for us to talk about. A reminder that you can pop your questions under the Q&A tab. So next we're going to come to Toby Young, and I will say, don't worry, not that one. It's a much nicer Toby Young that we're coming to. Toby is a composer and researcher whose work explores the boundaries between pop and classical music. Since winning the Guardian BBC Proms Young Composer of the Year in 2006 and the International ABRSM Composition Competition, that's a good little bit on my tongue there, Toby's music has been performed by renowned ensembles, including the London Symphony Orchestra, Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, Academy of Ancient Music, London Mozart Players, and the choirs of King's College, Cambridge, New College, Oxford, and Westminster Abbey. He's also written and co-written for numerous pop artists, including the Rolling Stones, I don't know if you've heard of them, Chase and Status, Duran Duran, and Ellie Goulding. Toby, let's come to you next, please.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so I mean, it's lovely to have your introduction before you. I dare say who I am. The only other thing I do is I'm also a researcher. I'm currently based at Guildhall, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London, and I work at kind of the intersection of music and society. I'm co-founder of something called the Institute of Social Impact Research in the Performing Arts, thinking about the kind of roles that music and the arts have in things like the climate emergency, but also thinking about what the mechanisms are by which the arts actually makes an impactful change. We've heard from Zoe some of these questions, starting to kind of think about what sort of things the creative sector can actually be doing rather than just sort of the lofty ideals of what they should be doing to change actual behaviours. So I'm currently working on a project, and I thought I'd just frame a little bit of what the project's about and then maybe play a bit of an example from it and see what you guys all think. Like many artists, I think I find the idea of the hyper-object, Timothy Morton's concept of climate emergency being this big kind of unattainable thing to be quite thought-provoking. And Morton talks about the hyperobject being outside our understanding of temporality and agency. It's so big, we can't possibly conceive of when it starts and stops. Things like certain forms of plastic and styrofoam, which won't actually be able to degrade by natural means by the end of our lifetimes, mean that these sort of things outlast us all. And he talks about the climate change being kind of actually being a bit like a religion in some ways. You have to kind of put your belief beyond your own experience, which is something that I think art has a lot of interesting dialogue with. Within this, there are no clear answers and manageable solutions. There are lots of people with different pathways you can take, but as an individual with individual agency, it's hard to see which path is the right one. And so it's up to us as artists, I think, to help kind of frame the sort of imagining of the world or the ideal world that people have to understand, and kind of our role to sort of help that discussion. What are the actual mechanisms of change that this happens by is a really interesting question for me. I think a lot of artists in this field talk about the material of art's job being to kind of change hearts as opposed to changing minds. There's a sense that there's a kind of an emotional thing that art can do to help. But I'm starting to be a bit doubtful of that. I think the thing that art can really do is open up a site of encounter, both with the ideas and perspectives of others in the form of an intervention. It can make us really think about our role and kind of question it in interesting ways. I'm becoming a bit skeptical of the idea of emotional kind of contextualization, because I think there's a lot of manipulation that goes on. You know, you look at certain documentaries and you have this kind of like big orchestral soundtrack behind it, and you maybe feel something for a bit. But actually, there's some new research in media psychology that suggests that maybe that doesn't actually translate into action. We have a feeling for a little bit, but it doesn't stay with us in the way that thinking about things and having to be confronted with ideas through the art can really do. And so I want to explore how that can sort of stimulate a powerful shift in consciousness and engagement and questioning with ideas. I have a long quote that I'm not going to say now, but if you want to know more about this, we can talk about this in the questions afterwards. It doesn't mean that the sense isn't important. And so I think there's a strong kind of mandate for us as artists to think about where sense and sensorial and haptic encounter does lead to change. Since you've already said I'm not that Toby Young, I might have one quotation from Theresa May, but not that Theresa May, a theatre researcher, who says that ecological art and performance should not only take environmental issues as their topics and push for change, they should awaken your senses and connect you with a more than human living world, or offer an experience of ecological intimacy. And I really find that idea of intimacy and connection to be quite a powerful one. So I think that art, and specifically music's role, is about facilitating connection, in particular understanding, empathy and communication between people, and other people, as well as between people and the natural world, and various kind of combinations in between. Also connecting us to think about teamwork, think that we can't achieve net zero, for example, by ourselves. We have to have some sort of collaboration. And then Timothy Morton talks about this being a project of commoning, which I think is very nice. So within this context, I think music can do two things. It can both help facilitate discussions, but it can also, as an activity in itself, help draw us together and make it a collaborative effort. With this in mind, I'm involved in a project called Raise a Voice, which is between Bristol Youth Choir, Bristol City Choir, Ex Parte Singers, Bristol Beacon, and then Liz Parks, who's from the Environment Agency, has been kind of part of the steering group around it. And we're thinking about how both the composition, a new piece, as well as the activity of bringing people together to sing that piece can have some sort of effect. We've got the new piece being written by me, which I'll talk about in a second, but a big education project around it, where the idea is that as well as attaching the piece to certain lesson plans within schools, there are also ways to facilitate discussion between the kids and the parents, try and kind of open up cross-generational dialogues around the topics of the piece and the sorts of issues we're thinking about. So kind of the same sort of recentering that Zoe was talking about earlier, with different kind of communities and marginalized voices, bringing them all together. The idea, of course, being to break down barriers, but also thinking about how this discussion can be accessible, how it can cross boundaries of age, gender, ethnicity, and try and celebrate the diverse and powerful voices that we all know aren't being listened to enough. The piece called Raise a Voice, I've also subtitled it A Rebellious Songbook for Our Time, which is perhaps more an aspiration than an actuality. And I'm working with an amazing writer called Jennifer Thorpe, who's a kind of activist in all sorts of ways. And together we've been thinking about how to connect the listener up with the risks of what we lose. Thinking about the hidden sides of nature and trying to reinvent the relationship between humans and nature, and the kind of cultural separation. So the idea of things we can't see, I think, is really important for us. Thinking that this is not only giving voice to the voiceless in terms of marginalized voices of humans, but also of nature. Thinking about, for example, worms and soil being important in this discussion, not just the charismatic animals that are often talked about in kind of the big campaigns. Thinking also about what we take for granted, the hidden stories behind, for example, the coffee bean or the chocolate bean, and how they're growing and shipping maybe is a thing that we don't think about in our everyday life when we're eating or drinking these commodities, as well as the hidden human costs. And so we're going to engage in the challenges of climate justice as well as part of this. I think that artistic interventions are often seen as sort of utopian cures for all of these things, but we're really trying as hard as we can to make sure that the encounter with people with this project really makes that space for encounter, for dialogue and for questioning. So as well as just having a concert, we're also thinking about ways that we can include pictures and stories in both the score and the program notes, as well as the lesson plan material. Think about all the different ways that people come into contact with it and what happens to the piece afterwards. Is it just a recording on the internet, or can we try and make sure other choirs do it? And there's a movement at the moment amongst the commissioners to try and get as many choirs as possible involved to all sing at the same time, which I think is quite a nice idea. We're also looking at ways we can test audience responses, perhaps with some sort of data collection afterwards, but that's sort of TBC. I would love to play you one of the songs about the worms or the soil, but unfortunately they're not being recorded yet. So I'm going to play you the kind of introductory song called We Will Fight. The idea of this being to kind of help spur on some agency and thinking again about the hyper objects, ways that we can all engage in this more actively. And so getting the kids to sing about how they can take a role in this. Matt, if you have the video, I think we have time just about to play it. I'm not sure if it's playing a second online. Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much.
Oh, Matt, I don't know if we're getting any sound on that, which is a bit of a shame. Perhaps just in terms of time, Toby, is that something that we could perhaps share on social media and link in the chat so that people can watch it?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
That would be great. So yeah, Matt, if you could,
it's not to be shared. Yeah, no, this is one that's to be shared. Yes, please do.
Great, thank you. Lovely, thank you so much, Toby. Again, there's a lot that I think we're going to be coming back to talk about there. This idea of encounter is certainly something which has already come up, and I've been sort of jotting notes down about. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. So Charlotte, our final speaker today. Charlotte is a creative consultant and director with a passion for projects activating positive change and discussion through art. From consultancy to creative production, over the past 10 years, Charlotte has been managing artist profiles, independent projects and cultural initiatives. Her projects and campaigns include Splash and Burn, Void Projects, Towards 2030, Vanguard, and hashtag Bushfire Brandalism. Charlotte, can we come to you, please?
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions for you both. Just listening the whole time, I'm like taking notes. So I guess I'm a little bit of a bridge between the two of you, looking at that research-based element, how we can be creating more of an accessible entry point for people. And then Toby, you on the other side, like directly with our perspective. And so I think in recent years, I've been trying to find ways to be more of a bridge to these actions, like looking between the two worlds. As Naomi said, I've been working with artist-led projects for the last 10 years, specifically trying to align myself with artists impassioned by social and environmental issues and trying to gear their platform towards it. Obviously, working directly with the artist, it's a completely different experience. You're in the studio doing the work, you're trying to wrap these narratives around it and think how we can connect it to people. But inevitably, when you start getting that sense of attention and grandeur, there's an opportunity to really amplify that by connecting with cities or corporates, whether that be more funding opportunities or just bigger scope for really promoting the projects. So as Naomi said, I run a cultural organization called Splash and Burn that was all about raising awareness of palm oil devastation in Indonesia. It was founded by a Lithuanian artist called Ernest Sakarovich, and it seeks to use street art to raise awareness of these problems by creating a wider consciousness for Western audiences. So we work with an Indonesian-based organization, learn about the issues that they're confronting, and then think of creative solutions for how to then move this into more mainstream conversation. I think that, Matt, we're going to watch a short video about Splash and Ban, and to give a little bit of a context of what these projects look like. As my area of expertise is working primarily with artists evolving from graffiti and street art, I think there's a DIY attitude that comes with these artists that's very dynamic, but also very accessible. Zoe, I resonated with a lot of what you were saying with this green flagging and people aligning with green agendas, and sometimes that can feel so difficult as it's part of a different category that we're trying to tick somehow, but trying to find these ways to embed it more inherently within the body of the story. I think that's where we really want to be moving towards. And so maybe we'll watch this short video and we'll talk a little bit more about the work in the city and what I'm going to be doing in Bristol this summer. Matt, over to you. Hopefully we'll have sound. That's great, Matt. Okay, I'm really glad that worked. There's a video project that we did in 2019 with the Spanish artist Esif, who is amazing. We worked with a Malaysian film crew called Studio Birthplace and an Indonesian musician called Yadi. The purpose of the project was to work with a local organization called the Orangutan, the OIC, the Orangutan Information Center, in helping them communicate issues of the differences between palm oil plantations and natural forestry. The core intent of the project was to expand the boundaries of the Loiso ecosystem by buying up the patches of dead palm oil plantations around it to then rewild it. So the art was really a creative solution for how we then start the first cuts into the dead land to then rewild it to expand the boundaries. So in doing projects like this, I'm now looking at how we can expand into the cities. Obviously, we see street art everywhere. We see it in Bristol most famously. In recent years, I've adopted the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and I found this to be a very interesting framework for then aligning wider social and environmental issues. One, in being able to find more manageable approaches to it, but also in aligning with a wider network of, Zoe, what you were saying, this multidisciplinary activity, looking at people in different sectors that are working on different ideas. And I think if we can be working to empower our creatives in these sectors and then trusting them with their vision, I think what we do is disrupt this little more archaic and traditional approach to conservation to really start unearthing new solutions to old problems effectively. This summer, I'm working with the Vanguard team. They'll be hosting an exhibition at Bristol Museum's Watershed. It will be running from the end of June through to the end of October. I am lucky enough to be curating one of the rooms in the exhibition, which is looking at the art of social change, a global network of artists, all lending their platform towards confronting these issues through the lens of sustainable development. There'll be both a research wall for you, Zoe, and an audio-visual experience, which will be pulling together some of the examples of, like the Rewild project, artist-led projects. We also have an extensive outreach program that will be looking at workshops, film screenings, and art interventions all throughout the city, but again, seen through the lens of sustainable development. It's again a step towards moving this to be part of the process, part of policy, that we should be having this as a consideration, not as an extra edge for charity or have we ticked this box. It should just be part of the process for everything that we're doing. And I think if we're able to disrupt that, that's really where the manageable or the sustainable change is going to come long term. That's all from me.
That was so good. Thank you. I'm buzzing from all of these conversations. I could talk to you all now for hours, but I'm conscious that we've only got 10 minutes. So I just wanted to reflect a few bits on some of the notes that I've sort of jotted down as you've all been talking. I think one of the phrases that you just used there, Charlotte, about new solutions to old problems, that's certainly a role that the arts and culture plays. And Zoe, you mentioned at the very beginning and in fact, Toby, you mentioned it as well, this idea of of imagination, making something that we don't know what it is yet. And actually it's by imagining a future that we don't know that we can try and find some of those solutions. And I think that's so crucial. And I think also moving on to, again, something, Toby, that you were talking about, that we've talked a lot together about art and culture creating this space for encounter, but actually that space shouldn't just be soft and fuzzy. It should be confrontational. It should be underpinned by powerful messages, underpinned with an empowering move to change, and actually part of broader, wider movements. A lot of what we do in the arts and culture is collaborative. It's with other organisations, and how, you know, exciting to see the film that you'd created there, Charlotte, and the number of partners that you were working with. Arts and culture can be that bridge. Charlotte, you described yourself as a bridge, but arts and culture itself is that bridge to bring together some of those different players and find a way of uniting us all. I thought, Toby, it was interesting to hear from you about actually it being not beyond just a simple performance. This is also about engagement work in schools and communities. So we might go to the theatre and see a show that's sort of tackling some of these issues, but actually being underpinned by layers and layers and layers of community work, by that work being devised, by workshops, all sorts of other things within that. So it was really interesting to hear some of those conversations. I've got a couple of questions that I want to come to, but just before we do that, I wondered if any of you, this is also an opportunity for the three of you for us to talk together, and I wondered if there were any sort of reflections that you were having as other members of the panel were talking. Charlotte, I know you were buzzing with things.
I was because obviously I consider myself to have been working in this field for a while, you know, looking at bridging the artists and the wider narratives. And I'm always so surprised by how few people there are. Like, you tend to know who's in the industry working along with you. And about a year ago, I got sight of a report that was written by Rosanna Lewis for the British Council. Sorry, I don't know if you've read it. It's called The Missing Pillar, and it talks about the crucial role of culture in essentially the sustainable development conversation, but more broadly looking at social and environmental discussion. We tend to see conversations around social, economic, and environmental, but there is a case being made for the overwhelming role that culture has to play, particularly post-COVID, you know, where we've been spending time with our books and our films and our music. Like, culture provides the context for a world worth living in, as opposed to, you know, the world that ticks over on itself. And I saw so many opportunities in the research you were laying out that would be so great as part of this ongoing research and dialogue with the British Council.
Fantastic. Yeah, and definitely a report for us all to look up. Zoe, is there anything you wanted to say in response to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of come back on what everybody said and just kind of, I think something, I mean, it's interesting because the title of this panel was about art, culture and engagement, but I think what we're all talking about here is something beyond engagement. Like, there's a lot of the like old argument that arts and culture are about kind of raising awareness, but I think we're at the point now where generally people are aware on some level about the climate or ecological emergency, right? So it's not about like climate change exists, it's about that deeper work about like the arts and culture can actually really kind of like enable people to activate themselves in. I think that's kind of something interesting that, you know, the title of this panel was engagement. We're all talking about something deeper and broader, and that next stage, which I think we've got to all engage in, and culture's got to be a part of if we're going to be, you know, carbon neutral by net zero by 2050.
I think that's where these bridges are essential, because as you just said, Naomi, like the provocative nature of these things and shocking a system into this is different. But then I think so often we see with a lot of creatives, there is this amazing action that happens, but there is so little around it in organizing that energy. Like, where does it go and how can we make it meaningful? And I think that's really this 2.0 level up, you know, for these creative projects. How do we mobilize around them? How do we give them support, whether that be looking at global press links, you know, and getting it into different kinds of publications? You know, does it bridge fashion? Does it bridge music? How can we create more accessible entry points to really reconnect with people? Because I think we so often see ourselves as disconnected from these problems, these wild issues, when really if we were to focus on our everyday lives and the infrastructures in which we live, we would see that we are contributing to it, maybe in a sense of ignorance as well, because we're tailored that way, right? Everything's set up to make things easy for us. So we're enabled to think that way. But this disruption, I think, is an imperative.
Can I ask an antagonistic question? I obviously, I think this is all an amazing conversation. I guess I wonder whether, do we think there's, or do you guys think there's such thing as potential harm through creativity. There's a kind of utopian discussion amongst, I think, a lot of the kind of policymakers, but certainly artists, that if you're an artist and you engage in this, you're doing good work, and that there's, you know, kind of a thing about just everyone getting on board and doing something in support of you know, raising awareness. I'm not saying raising awareness, but there's this discussion. I wonder if there's such a thing as bad climate art, or climate art could cause actual harm or do something damaging in some way, or do we think that anyone who's a creative who gets involved will automatically be helping?
Oh, great question. Zoe, I think I'm going to come to you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just, I mean, I think we need to kind of like, for me, it's about the climate action, right, that you're engaging with, because there's a lot of destructive climate people who are under the banner of climate action who kind of reproduce really exclusive narratives or are greenwashing. And like, maybe a lot of those people think that they're engaging in something really well, but like corporations have like got so much money in trying to kind of co-opt like radical narratives. There's a lot of money to be had in being like, we're green, we're sustainable. Look at like H&M, who've like their new brand thing is that we're sustainable. Like, come on, you need to change your entire, like, you can't exist as a fast fashion brand and be sustainable. So I think that 100% does exist if you know, artists and creators are kind of like participating in these kind of exclusive, like corporatized, white middle class, I know that's ironic coming from me, like climate action that we do see like rampant in the West. But I think that's also like the kind of like, we've got creatives on the other side of things who are able to kind of like really engage in kind of like radical education. So I don't think necessarily by being an artist you're immediately morally amazing if you engage in anything socially or environmentally productive. It's about kind of the movement itself and us dissecting that movement and how you engage with the movement, I think.
Fantastic. Again, I'm conscious of time. There were a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, and this is about, as we've just talked about, this we're at a levelling up moment. This is about us all becoming active participants, both as a sector, but also in terms of audiences. So my questions here are, what next? What do we do, and how do we do it? So firstly, how do we do that for the arts and cultural sector? What do we need? Is that infrastructure? Is it funding? You know, what is it that if you had kind of a magic wand, you know, what would happen? What would be there? And also for audiences, what can we be supporting? What can we be funding through our own pockets? What can we be attending? So if I could just come to each of you in turn with what the arts and culture sort of needs and what we should be doing as an audience. So Toby, I'm going to come to you first.
I think it's so interesting from what Zoe just said, the idea that they're sort of various different people doing good work, various people trying to pretend they're doing good work and not necessarily. I think as an artist, I'm lucky I fell into this sort of work through connections with people who I think are doing really, really great work, and I want to kind of meaningfully help them and support them in that work. But support for artists to find climate bodies to collaborate with and kind of pathways for that to happen, I think would be really valuable. In terms of what work gets funded, I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff, but I would just say more diverse voices and more diverse kinds of artistic languages and mediums being used to make sure that every kind of potential audience who might engage with this work has some kind of art that comes to them that can kind of pull them in. That'd be it for me.
Great. Charlotte, I'm going to come to you.
Part of what I'm doing for this summer is working to amplify the messages around sustainable development. Bristol's a really interesting city for this one, as it was one of the first cities in the world to issue a voluntary local review, which is kind of a citywide assessment of how the city is performing through the lens of sustainable development. So you have 17 different goals that are looking across the social, the environmental, us as humans, like how is our well-being and our health. And in 2018, Bristol submitted a report to the UN Political Forum for how they are performing as a city. And since that time, they've established an SDG alliance. I've been working very closely with Alan McLeod for the last year, getting to know the city's policies, but also connecting with organizations on the ground. As part of the outreach, we're connecting with 17 community groups, all considered through the lens of sustainable development, and we'll be doing a series of art interventions to kind of work in partnership, artists and organizations, to really amplify the great work that Bristol is doing to localize the goals. I think this is a really interesting framework, and where you have a city like Bristol that has worked to embed it as part at a city level, I think there is more opportunity for people to connect with this energy to then amplify it going forward. So it's really kind of a work in progress and a social experiment, if you like, in aligning culture with sustainable dialogues.
And absolutely a project to be looking out for later on this year, as well as the Vanguard.
Yes, the Natural History Consortium will be one of our community partners in the capacity of SDG 15, Life on Land. So expect to see a wonderful nature-inspired intervention during the summer.
Great. So do keep your eyes out for those. Sign up to various newsletters. Keep an eye on bulletins. Zoe, finally to you, please.
What Charlotte just said, I think it'd be great to see more opportunities from like a policy making perspective, to have like active engagement from creative people, like creatives like engage with like policymakers. Like, I don't know if any of you saw the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal video where they used watercolor as like a retrospective on what would happen if they implemented the Green New Deal. Like, that was an amazing collaboration between artists and politicians that like really brought people along. And like there's so many other examples of this. So I think for me, it would be like potentially like scientists, engineers, policymakers kind of recognizing the role of kind of arts and creativity for having like a really deep and impactful role in things like city planning and like projects such as that. So yeah, and then just the artists needs, I think, yeah, capacity, resources, etc., which would come from that relationship, I hope.
Fantastic. I can't believe that we are already out of time. It feels like we've just scratched the surface. Please do have a look at Zoe, Charlotte and Toby, Google them, follow them on various social media, do sign up to various sort of newsletters and bulletins. There is a lot going on. Have a look at other projects that you might be finding, and then share them with friends and family. There is work that's happening, and do support it and share it where you see it, and fund it where you are able to. Thank you so much to our three speakers this afternoon, Zoe, Rasbash, Charlotte, Pyatt and Toby Young. I know that we're on a tight timeline for sessions starting, so do get up, stretch your legs, roll your shoulders before your next session. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and thank you very much for supporting the Natural History Consortium. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.